I'm John Callis. This talk is called, verbosely, The Effect of Anti-Circumvention Provisions on Security. It is about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of the United States. And I started doing this about 3 years ago, and the main topic of this that was always unstated but I drove toward was to convince you that the DMCA was a bad idea. This is a lot less hard today than it was in 1998. But nonetheless, particularly what I'm talking about here are the anti-circumvention provisions that are in it. They are interesting because they create brand new crimes that never existed before. It makes things that used to be civil problems now be criminal problems. There are a number of exceptions and defenses in it, but they leave a large problem. And as I say in the bottom now, this is now understatement. 3 years ago, when I would talk about the horrible things that could happen, I didn't think of things as bad as, people not really being able to travel because they were afraid they might have done something illegal where they were going to. So, why should a European care? And the reason that Europeans should care is that DMCA is the U.S. implementation of the WIPO Treaty. This is the World Intellectual Property Organization Treaty. This is a WTO UN thing, and every country is supposed to do their own version of it. Now, the treaty doesn't require that you do something as onerous as the DMCA. And when the DMCA was going through Congress, this was one of the things we pointed out, was that they would say, oh, we're required by treaty to do this. It's not us, this is just the update of the Berne Convention. And your media companies are just as greedy as ours. I mean, come on, it's either Murdoch or Time, and in 5 years they'll be the same anyway. The UK already has its own version of the DMCA that was passed a couple of years ago. I know nothing about this. I've only been told that this is here, and it may actually be worse than the US version. But this has just been people talking in email and bars, so who knows. The DMCA actually slipped through the US law system. People opposed to it had to fight against massive lobbying, and they had very little support. I got involved in this in the summer of '98. I worked for Pretty Good Privacy Network Associates, and my legal person called me up and said, have you heard of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act? And as it had happened about a year before, I had taken a course in copyright law at Berkeley, so I knew all about it and said, oh yeah, it's really horrible, it's a threat to fair use, it's got all this, that, the other thing. And she said, well, it passed the US Senate 99-1. And it's going up in the House. So you're a security expert, so stop having any opinions about anything other than security, because I can probably get you in front of the House and you can talk about things, but you have to remember that you are an encryption expert. You are not, for example, a publishing expert. The library people are experts on that. So I testified to Congress on it. I worked with committees to mitigate some of the badness on it. It's like, if you think the current one is bad, you should have seen the other ones. And over the last 3 years, I have been talking, writing papers, and so on about it, and it's now becoming more and more germane to everyday work. 3 things I'm going to go over here are a history of security design, and I'm going to go through that rather quickly. An awful lot of what is there you don't need to see. I would give this for quasi-technical audiences, and I'm also going to go through a little bit of intellectual property history and interactions between intellectual property and security design, the last being what I think that you can do to help. Now, there are 2 basic models of security design, what I call the quote-quote closed model and the quote-quote open model. Now, the closed model is the traditional way you do security. You have your design done by a closed group. Frequently, you get external review to work on it, and you come up with a design. Now, in spite of the fact that as time goes on, we see more and more cases where this didn't work, and they keep cropping up. And every time I get this, there's a new one. Been more 802.11 web breaks, there's been other things. There are nonetheless reputable people who claim it's the only way to get good security, and even other people that I know who are basically in favor of open models say that the right way to get something done is to get a small committee together, have them work, and have external review on it. So, even though I'm not one of these, they have a lot of merit in what they're saying. The advantages of this is, first of all, that you have no committee-itis. If people have a closed design, it's harder to break. Now, of course, once it's opened up, it's frequently easier to break because they didn't do an inherently good job. You can also do targeted designs. I've worked with other standards committees, and one of the problems with those is that people are going to use your standard for things you never intended it to be used for. So you have to do a lot of work to make sure that there's some robustness, and if you want to do only one specific thing, having a small group do it is a good thing. And also one of the advantages is security for security. The disadvantages are that there can be team blindness. I mean, if you can convince yourself you're doing the right thing, but if you'd only talk to 5 other people, it wouldn't be. It's easy to just wave your hand at a hard problem and say, well, we're not really worried about that. It's also relatively easy to design completely the wrong thing, and of course, as we know about security through obscurity, it doesn't really work. Open design is the newer way to do security. It's about 30 years old or so. It comes from the rise of international standards bodies. It comes from the rise of needing things to interoperate. In these designs done in public journals, frequently mailing lists, I work a lot on the IETF, and all official business happens on mailing lists. And all you have to do to be a quote-unquote member of the IETF is subscribe to a mailing list, which is the ultimate in open design because anybody who cares counts. An important thing to remember about this is also that my laser isn't working. It's a principle of minimal secrets. That the idea in open design is to figure out the least number of things that you can keep secret from your attacker and still have it work. Now, the advantages of this is that more eyes find problems faster. There's also fewer surprises on things because people are constantly working on it. There are always still surprises. Just this late last spring, there were new attacks on PGP that we had never heard of before. Very clever things, but you find them nonetheless. Now, the disadvantages are that there are some problems that can't be solved without some obscurity. Content protection, digital rights management may be one of those things. One of the other problems is how do you keep openness from being designed by committee? This is a real problem, and what it really boils down to is that the people who are on the committees who run these things need to have a certain amount of skill in controlling the group. One of the things that you can do, for example, is to talk about schedules and say, well, yes, that's a really good idea, but can we do that in version 2? Can we do that in version 1.1? No, I'd really like to have something published by the end of next month, so we can't debate this for more than another week. And that's a way to do this. You also have far fewer advantages over your opponent if they know exactly what you're working with. Now, open design is not open source. Historically, all operating systems were open designed in that you got the source code with it. If you bought a computer, say 25 years ago, you'd get the source code, and one of the first things you did when you installed it was you would compile the source code for your computer. And you had to have everything. You knew how it all worked. But the source code was still owned by the company that did it. When I was at PGP, for example, we published all of our source code. We'd let you verify it. We would let you run it through debuggers. But we didn't give you a license to the software. We still believed that you needed to either use the freeware for non-commercial purposes or buy the commercialware. Nonetheless, we opened everything up. And these are all ways that you can have open design without having to go into the whole, have everybody be able to do everything to your stuff, because there are lots of people who worry about that. Also, it is not a matter of either or. You can mix elements of open and closed design, and you can get better security with either one alone. The phrase that I use here is that open designs give you armor and closed designs give you camouflage. You should never confuse camouflage with armor, but a camouflage tank is much better than a non-camouflage tank. There are just places to use each. I'll give you an example of this. I was at Counterpane for a couple of years, and we built a system that did secure internet communications between some of our own monitoring devices and our host systems. We used for our main communication transport SSL from OpenSSL, but we also took a tweak on Blowfish. If you are a crypto person, there are a whole bunch of constants that are actually digits of pi in Blowfish. And if you change them to another set of digits of pi, you get something that's just as good as Blowfish, it just doesn't interoperate. So we did some of that. I made 15 new ciphers, got US export approval for them all, and we did this as part of what we called our "you must be at least installed to hack this system" defenses. That, I can tell you now that what we did was we made small variants on Blowfish, but it meant that a script kiddie couldn't come up with a connection to our system because it would say, I'm talking SSL, hi, I'm talking SSL, I use cipher 147. I've never heard of that. Well, goodbye. So, and this is something you can talk about, and it adds to your security, but it is still nonetheless an open design because you can say the basis of what we are doing is upon OpenSSL. The basis of what we're doing is a published cipher where we change some contents. We're just not going to tell you what they are. You can consider those to be essentially additional key material. Modern civilian cryptology, as I call it, is perhaps the greatest success of open design. In the last 25 years or so, people have been working on building new cryptographic systems, and they've all been doing it in the open, which previously, all throughout history, crypto was the domain of either guilds, nations, corporations, and they all did it themselves. They didn't talk to anybody else. And over the last 25 years, people talk to each other. The question then is, that essentially the community has been asking, is can you make a secure system if only the keys, if only these small little quantities are kept secret? And it turns out the answer is yes. There's nothing that there's no law of nature that said that the answer had to be yes, but it happened to be yes. And this has been really great for all of us because we end up with more secure systems by having everything be out in the open. So, protecting intellectual property, that's what we're really talking about. This is a hard problem. It's a really hard problem. And it may be impossible. There are lots of people who in fact claim that it is impossible to get any sort of digital rights management system that works. Now, one of the ironies, as I say in my note, is that it's the cryptographers who are unhappy with this. I worked one summer on a digital rights management thing where you can protect stuff for a customer. We produced 8 documents as part of what we gave to them, and the biggest one was the risks and threats document. And as we were going on, we paid hundreds of dollars an hour to do this. We would say, well, if somebody does this, they can break it. Yeah, okay, that's fine. And if they do this, they can break it. Okay. Well, if they do something else here and I have 5 more, they can also break it. Well, that's fine. I just want to keep grandmas out. Well, but there are script kiddies, and one thing. No, that's okay. Which, if you're interested in the technical aspects of this is mind-boggling. I do not understand it, but there still comes a point when, as someone who's trying to earn a living, you just take the checks because they keep telling you they're happy with what you're doing. But If it is technically impossible to protect intellectual property with technology, then legal protections are the only ones that are available. And this is kind of scary because it indicates that we want actually to spend some work trying to find some good ones, because if we don't find good technical ones, the only thing they've got are laws, and we see how successful they're being with the laws so far. We got to this point with intellectual property over the last 300 years or so. And in the 1700s, the idea of intellectual property came about. Before then, if you heard a song that somebody else sang, you just sang it. People would publish books without the author's consent. They would edit them up, and maps would get stolen and redrawn. The idea came about because there was a belief that there is a societal benefit to having intellectual property. And the goal of having intellectual property is, in fact, the societal benefit. It's to reward people who create things, and thus to make it so that you can make a living by being somebody who's clever. You don't have to be already rich. So it's something that especially the IP owners forget, is that the real goal of these laws is to benefit society, not to give them something that they can charge for. But nonetheless, it's understandable that they want more protection. It's also understandable that the rest of us are really skeptical of their claims. Historically, this worked by, first of all, authors would get rights to a work, and then the author died young. The author's family would say, but now we have no way to make any money. So they extended it past the author's death, and it kept going on and on from there. 26 years, 50 years, 75 years. And it's however long it needs to be to make it so that Mickey Mouse doesn't fall out of the domain of the Disney company. You think I'm making that up. One of my friends who's a journalist has as one of his taglines, digital technology is the universal solvent of intellectual property rights. And this may very well be true, and it's both good and bad, because he's someone who creates things, but he's living with the fact that it's really very difficult to do this. Bandwidth willing, it's very easy to make and easy to distribute digital copies of something. We're at the point now where it's hard to do this with video and very easy to do it with music. And there's a fundamental question here that I have at the bottom, which is, how do the artists get paid? I was, when I was in college, a musician. And I ended up going into mathematics instead of music, partly because all the stories about starving artists are true. It finally dawned on me when I was about 18. So there's got to be a way for these things to be done. If you read a number of things that are in the United States, there was a really good article that came out about a year ago from Courtney Love, who is the singer in Hole, who used to be married to Kurt Cobain, where she described how much actually gets eaten away from a contract. And if you hear some musicians who end up with, say, a $1 million recording contract, well, first, their agent gets 20% off the top, and then they have to pay their own recording fees, and then they have to do this, and they have to do that. And it turns out that when you get a $1 million recording contract, you end up seeing about $40,000 a year. And it's really rather frustrating that you could be making more money at a convenience store than you can being a musician with a $1 million contract. And most people don't get $1 million contracts. So how do these people get paid? And that's one of the things that if we can solve that problem, it will open up all sorts of things, because clever people will be able to make their living as good website producers, whoever else you want to. There are all sorts of ideas about how to do this, but they don't exist yet. Micropayments do not exist. There's no good way for me to encourage somebody who does something what I like to do more. There are some nice protocols that friends of mine have developed. Schneider and Kelsey did street performers, but they haven't been turned into anything real. The intellectual property owners have a history of wanting a lot and giving very little back and being benefited by changes that they said would absolutely destroy them. These are all United States cases. This is a U.S. law, so I normally talk in the U.S. In the late 80s, there were cases, all of these went to the Supreme Court, by the way, which is why I have them on this bullets, where videotapes were under assault. And the main use for videotapes, in addition to copying movies, was for time shifting, taping a program at one time and watching it some other time. And it got defended and said that that would be okay. But of course, the movie company said, "Oh my God, we're gonna die if people can tape movies." Well, now it turns out that about half the income they get from any given movie comes from the videotape rentals. That videotapes saved Hollywood, and we had to ram it down their throat. Similarly, they said changing recording techniques for tapes and LPs. Oh my God, we're gonna die. And they didn't. Actually, they made more last year with Napster around than they made in any previous year. Clone computer peripherals is another important one. And that is for reverse engineering. That in the 60s, there was, I think it was Ampex, who wanted to make tapes and disk drives to hook up to IBM computers. And IBM said, no, the schematics of all of our buses are all copyright. You can't do that without violating our copyright. And the courts decided that if you have a monopoly, which IBM basically did, and you have copyright, if that means you can control everything, then what you have is legal enforcement of the copyright, of the monopoly. So they said, no, that's just not right. The last one that I put down here is parodies. In the United States, a parody is one of the most highly defended things that you can do in terms of free speech. And we have to thank for that Larry Flint and Weird Al Yankovic, who managed to take it all the way to the Supreme Court. And these days, when somebody writes a parody song of something, they go, "Oh, what an honor it is to have Weird Al do a funny version of my song." And it's a much bigger honor when they can't stop him than it was when they thought they could sue him. If your livelihood involves intangibles, which mine does, I used to do for enjoyment silversmithing because it existed. You pick things with hammers and physical. If you do music, you do software, you write, you're involved in intellectual property. Even if you do open source software, all of the open source licenses are twists on copyrights. They're new and interesting ways to use copyright. And so you are living with this. One of the fellows that I work with has as his explanation of things that the problem with this comes from imbalance. That if everybody could protect intellectual property as well as Sony and Disney and the rest of them could, then we could start putting up a website with your own little music that people like, they pay you a dime, a penny, whatever else. And if you could protect that, then you could do new and interesting things. The problem is the powerful have it and we don't. And that the way that these things are being designed is they're being designed to shut us out. John Gilmore wrote a really great article a couple of months ago, and he's talking later. And one of the things that he pointed out is that if you take your own music and you record it on some types of media, like mini discs, you can't get it back out again. The intellectual property protections protect you from getting at your stuff. Okay. Moving on a little more to the actual heart of the matter, DMCA makes it a felony to circumvent, and this is a quote, a technological measure that effectively controls access to a work protected under this title. There are interesting things to pay close attention to, one of which is the word effectively, which has never been defined. There are lots of people who claim that they know what it means, but we don't have any sort of real definition of what it means. It also does not affect things that can't be copyrighted, like databases. So there are things that you can encrypt, and breaking them is okay, which is one of the reasons why some people have said, oh, breaking web would violate the DMCA, and I've said, I don't think so, because it's not protecting something that is used, it's not protecting copyrighted work. There are a number of exemptions. The interesting ones for us are encryption research, computer repair, which is, an interesting one, so you can't, the old IBM thing back and forth. Reverse engineering. This is something that, the phrase reverse engineering for the purpose of creating interoperable equipment. That's completely protected. Also, security testing. There's a marvelous talk about rights and defenses. If something is a right, they can't take you to court for doing it. If it's a defense, you tell the judge, well, the defense is, Your Honor, that and that's why it's okay. It is always better to not talk to judges. Being involved in the legal system in any country is no fun at all. You don't want to do it. Another big question is whether or not fair use. And typically fair use gets talked about as being, the right to quote something. Well, fair use is more than just that. When I talked about interoperable equipment, reverse engineering, that is fair use. It was declared to be fair use. And it's really important because that ruling is what gave us to today standards for IDE, USB, FireWire, SCSI, the rest. Those all exist because US judges said you can't make those things secret. And once they stopped letting big companies like IBM keep them secret, they decided to come up with international standards because you couldn't stop anybody anyway. In the UK, I know that fair use is a right. In the US, we don't know. I have been on panels with lawyers who spent 5 minutes going back and forth. It's right, it's defense, it's right, it's defense. And I have maintained that a defense that has been defended all the way to the Supreme Court is arbitrarily close to a right. What's the difference? And I don't know what it's going to be in your country, so it's one of those things to keep under mind. The problem with the exemptions that are in the DMCA is that they are defenses, they are not rights. So when they arrest you, you can say, but the reason why it's okay that I was doing that is ... The exemptions that are for this are pretty torturous. They require notification, asking permission, so on and so forth. Ed Felton, with his SDMI break, was almost certainly protected by it. But he decided not to publish. And there are a couple of very good reasons that he decided not to publish, one of which being he didn't want to end up in a court. Well, he didn't want to end up being on the wrong end of the court. It's one thing to be someone suing somebody else, but it's another to be the one who's being sued, or worse, the one who's being criminally prosecuted. Niels Ferguson, who's going to be talking here today, on Sunday, has also decided not to publish things because of the DMCA. He's been told that these things would violate it. In Felton's case, he was sent a threatening letter by a lawyer, and they turned around a couple days later and said, haha, we didn't mean it. How could you possibly have thought that we meant that we would do anything bad? No, we were just warning you. Yeah, right. This is exactly what is meant by chilling effect. If you listen to in particular, U.S. discussions on this, when we talk about free speech, we talk about the chilling effect. And this is exactly what the chilling effect is. If you don't know what it is that you can do, it's in American law, it's a central precept, sort of the meta law, that you have to know whether or not what you're doing is right or wrong. You have to be able to have some good way to know whether or not you're breaking the law. And all sorts of interesting laws, like the anti-porn laws of a few years ago, one of the attacks on them was it was difficult to know what was legal and what was not legal to do. And this is one of the things that produces this chilling effect. This new law creates an imbalance between the rights and the responsibilities of makers and breakers. Remember, there are rights and responsibilities. For every right you've got, you have a responsibility. And this cuts both ways. There are now penalties for bad research. Where they can define what bad is, but there's protection for bad security. We also, as part of it, don't have a good definition of some of the terms. I mentioned before that effective is never really defined. Things that are banned, I say here primary use is never well defined. It's illegal to make a device that has as its primary use that it will circumvent some copy protection thing. And this is an important thing because without the primary use, debuggers would be illegal. Other things would be illegal, and that is there precisely so that testing tools and other things are not made illegal by the DMCA. But we don't know what primary use really is. So, does this protect snake oil? Well, we have some real-world cases, one of which being DCSS. That was a particularly interesting case, in my opinion, because what was originally done and buried in the furor around it is that some people wanted to make software to be able to play DVDs on Linux. This is clearly reverse engineering for the purpose of creating interoperable equipment. And all of the brouhaha around it has seemed to forget that. And I believe that the people who are fighting that really need to keep hammering on the fact that what this is this is an update of the Ampex case. We've seen this before. This is nothing but the same thing as making a tape drive or a disk drive that's compatible, except that we're doing it in software instead of in hardware now. The Sklearov case is all about ebooks. And one of the things that he published, have you read his paper? It's an interesting paper. I made sure that I got a copy of the website with it on there before it went away. But Adobe made a framework that they could wrap around PDFs. And then they had plugins for doing security. And one of the examples that they gave was a Road 13 one. And somebody who was charging like $3,000 for a hardware dongle and other things was basically doing just a small modification on Road 13. It's like, give me a break. So it really does look like snake oil is being protected. It's less clear with SDMI because that was some very interesting work. It just happened that it was easy to break it. The really big problem is that intellectual property has to be protected. And that's something that if you want to be able to do things that involve intangibles, it has to be there. And even if you don't agree with it, you're going to have to live with it. As I've also said, many of the objections that are really good objections to content protection systems go away if anybody can do it. And we don't know if this is even possible. But there are also other rights that have to be protected, and these rights are now being trampled on in order to make it so that people who want to broadcast news stories can charge for them every time you see them. An interesting effect is that no other legislation I've ever heard of protects low quality, and no other legislation impedes quality testing. It's it's interesting because every country has food, water, drug, purity laws. There are standards you have to meet, but when it comes to computer security, hey, Road 13 is good enough. Why do you need anything better? You know, if you can throw somebody in jail for breaking Road 13, why hire a cryptographer? Now, one possible fix for this is liabilities for bad security. You know, if you punish making a system that could be broken, and you wouldn't even really need to make criminal penalties for it, you could probably do it only with damages. You know, make a bad cipher, go to jail. Very few of us really want this. In previous versions of this, I said nobody really wants this, and it turns out that there's always one or two people, oh, I think that would be great. Another thing to remember is that the customers of these systems are really happy. And there's something that's sort of ethically squirrely, if you'll permit that word, about making it be wrong to be hired to do something really weird for somebody and then being happy about it and making them happy. Because the people who are asking for these security systems, when you tell them, you know, there's no way in the world that somebody can't just hook up a little thing and tape the music. Okay, that's fine. Making systems and breaking systems is a dance. And you have to be able to do both parts of it. The people who are the best at making good security systems have experience at breaking them, and vice versa. You know, one of the good ways to learn security is to look through how things were broken and see where the edges and things could be pried up are. If breaking is punished, the makers will be lax. There's no incentive for quality. In economics, there's a law called Gresham's Law. Gresham's Law is that bad money drives out good. This is one of the reasons why counterfeiting is a bad thing, because if there's counterfeit money, people don't trust the money, and you can't do basic sorts of buying and selling things. And there are going to be real economic advantages for a customer to use the least effective form of security, because the weak stuff's cheaper. The real crooks, I mean the ones who are running warehouses of stuff in Shenzhen province in China, they could probably break it anyway. And if you have opportunities for policing in the press, you get more publicity, which means it will scare people off of things because they think, oh my God, if I could go to jail if I do this wrong, then it's like then you don't really need anything. Many years ago, when Macintoshes first came out, there was a little flag that you could put on a file. It was the "Please do not copy me" flag. And people made copy protection schemes where they would give you software on a floppy, and one of the key files would have the "Please do not copy me." And if you duplicated the disk, the copy program wouldn't copy the files that had that flag. Is that effective? Well, sure, it's effective if that's what the software does, but as sure as night becomes day, somebody wrote a program that copied a disk that didn't check the "Please do not copy me" disk. And this became the first copy protection breaking program. The end result of this sort of Gresham's Law of security is that we'll end up with a "Please do not copy me" flag. And they won't need anything more because you can get thrown in jail for anything, for breaking that. I think that fixing the problem is actually a lot easier if you have access to lawmakers than you think. I've written the Librarian of Congress on this and talked about it. What we need to do is we need to tie circumvention to infringement. The problem now is that circumvention in isolation is a felony. If you make 10,000 copies of The Lion King and you broke something to do that, I'm willing to believe that sure, that's worse than just making 10,000 copies and selling them alone. So, it's like I could understand turning this into some sort of aggravated infringement, but we have to have the researchers left alone because the real pirates that are out there are going to continue to do what they want, and that's what the security is needed for. The idea that I have in thinking about this is you want to set up the balance and you want it to get righted. You want to have something for the people who own works because, if we make it easy enough to be a work owner, we'll all be work owners, and you want to have something for the people who are doing the making and breaking. So, here's what you can do. I thought that just referring to this as the Snake Oil Protection Act, that pointing out that this is the only law that I've ever heard of, and I don't know if anybody else has, in the world that encourages bad quality, that encourages systems that don't work, systems that are just not very good. And we have to leave the researchers alone. It's also important to remember that the researchers include the Cult of the Dead Cow, Loft at Stake, the Shmoo Group. Other people like this are researchers too. All of the good researchers, in my testimony to Congress, the really interesting results of the last decade have come out of the blue from somebody you never heard of before. That the first time you hear of them is that they've got something really interesting that they've found out. And that you need to encourage that, because if you don't, you aren't going to get good systems. Now, I've done that in record time. Are there any questions?
You mentioned that the word effective was not defined, but by just the Webster's definition of it, if you can in fact break a system, is it thus not effective, and thus it wasn't enforceable in the first place because that had been tested?
The question was that the dictionary definition of effective is whether or not it really works. I'm paraphrasing. And so what does that mean? And I side with you on this. I had in previous versions of this more slides on DCSS, where I point out that it was broken by a minor. And, let's face it, teenagers are clever people, and in many ways some of the sharpest of us around, but if somebody who is not old enough to vote breaks a crypto system, was it really effective? On the other hand, there are legal definitions of effective, which means does it do what it was intended to do under normal operation? And if under normal operation it was intended to not make you copy something, then that's the other end of it's effective. The problems that I see in both of these is that on the one hand, if you take effective to the extreme of where I am, then something isn't effective unless it really, really, really works, and there are a lot of really good reasons for believing that's impossible. The bad part of that will mean that we will be stuck with laws. We won't have technical solutions. On the other end of things, if anything that click here and it won't be copied works, if the please do not copy me bit is effective, then there's no need for any security at all. Yeah, question?
One thing I didn't hear being mentioned is that, we all know do not lead into temptation. That's a valid stance. Like, in the German army, for instance, you get punished if you steal something out of the locker from one of your fellow soldiers. You also get punished if you don't lock it, if you left it open so you can take it out. You actually are being punished if you actually let in temptation. And I think it's the same thing with weak security. That's Apple talking to it. I think it's actually immoral to do that. It's like in your face. Here, I put it on the plate. It's ruling, but you're not allowed to take it. It's cruel. Does this kind of stance ever actually get? Is this brought up in legislation, or is it just kind of just you thinking of?
It gets brought up, but people don't like those sorts of laws. I mean, you know, that's very closely related to what I was saying about penalties for bad security. And, you know, for example, I made a security system for somebody where of, you know, like half the papers I gave them were all the ways that it wouldn't work. And they were really, really, really happy. So did I do anything wrong by doing work for somebody who was happy with what I was doing? But there are also legal notions in the U.S. of things like attractive nuisances. An example of that in our legal system would be that if you don't put up a fence around the swimming pool and somebody walks into it and falls into it, you are in some respects liable either civilly or criminally because you made it easy for that event to happen. I think that could be a way to do it, but it runs into problems because there are some interesting security principles. I mean, one principle of security is that you don't need to put 10 guilders in a safe. And on the other hand, you don't want to use a 3-digit combination lock on a bank. So in computer security, we don't have a good idea of where the scale goes. When it comes to locks, we know, you know, we have a really good idea of how to do it. I'm now working for a company that does a secure microprocessor, and one of the things that I say to people from time to time is, it's a $100 lock. We want it to be for sale, list $100. It's a $100 lock. If somebody wants to spend $10,000 worth of effort, and you know that can be either time or money, divided up however you want, and they break it, you know, is it part of our responsibility to make something that costs $100 that could protect $1 million? Because again, you know, if you make it hard to make something by putting too many penalties on the makers, then they won't make anything. You don't have any security. I mean, a long time ago when I was on MIT, there were no file protections. It was common that people would read each other's mail, and people would say, "Oh yes, you know, I always read Professor so-and-so's mail because it's always very interesting and I learn a lot." Other questions?
Yeah, it's worth noting, by the way, that now that Napster has gone out of general circulation, that the record industry itself estimates that the sales have gone down 8%. And in fact, as you mentioned, it was up 8% last year when Napster was in operation. Now the sales are going down because people aren't able to look at things and learn about things and explore.
Yeah, it may not be that simple because, you know, remember we are in the middle of a recession right now.
We were in
But-
the same recession.
But yeah, I mean, I agree that without being able to shop, people are less likely to buy. And if there were secure ways to do this, you know, it might encourage everything. Who's that question over here?
In my understanding of the U.S. system, a law that helps making people more money is good law. So if the industry could be convinced that the DMCA hurts them in making money, there would be a really good chance of getting the lower rule. Is there been any effort in convincing industry that the DMCA hurts them?
Oh yeah. I mean, when I spoke to Congress, it was on behalf of the electronics industry that was fighting the movie industry and the record industry. Because the electronics industry wants to make cheaper players, they want to make things that you're going to buy. They don't want to have legal requirements to make things that are going to make it less likely for you to buy them. Whereas the movie industry doesn't want you to make copies and watch without paying them. So you know, these two businesses are at odds with each other. Yes.
Is there a precedent for testing, primary use kind of thing, because some reverse engineering and like compiler methods involved? Is there any precedent to that that's been set?
Testing tools are exempt.
Like how
That what is illegal is something that has as its primary use breaking a copyrighted work. And that's as its primary use.
so for instance, Purify is sort of kind of in some cases so
It is no. Purify is a development tool. It is not intended for breaking. You can use it that way, I mean, you know, it's like a hammer. You can use a hammer for driving nails, and you can use a hammer for smashing people's heads in. But, you know, it would be illegal to make a thing that says by this mace, you can smash people's heads in.
They're called guns.
So in the case of this defendant, you can get this and it'll resolve religion, it will resolve all the symbols that you can find where else, and give you the social services you possibly get. But it also says, like, you might be able to use this for security testing and
It doesn't have that as its primary use. People do this all the time. I mean, in various parts of the U.S., for example, drug paraphernalia is illegal in many jurisdictions. So you will walk into a shop with little tiny aluminum pipes and water pipes, and they say, for tobacco only. So, you know, and that is because that it is the same sort of primary use thing. That primary use is in many cases what it's advertised for. And there is in many ways no difference between a backup tool and a copying tool. So, and they're not, you know, they're not outlawing backup tools. So, in many cases, it's what do you say on the front part of the box.
So in the case of DCSS, for instance, would it be arguable or has it been argued that the primary use is not for you?
I think that the best defense that the DCSS people have is to say that it is for reverse engineering for the purpose of creating compatible equipment. And they need to silence the people who talk about other things. Niels?
You asked about laws, you said that you don't know about any laws that protect that security, but things like breaking and entry and burglary laws and some jurisdictions outlaw having burglary tools. That might be an example.
Yeah,
They don't make it illegal to test blocks.
that's true. And there is actually talk about that. I read a paper by dear Dorothy Day saying, you know, should we make certain sorts of testing tools to be the equivalent of nuclear weapons and firearms? Question over there?
One question. I want to know whether you would support more for big companies to take away the fair use.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that I think is the worst part about this, is that if there is content that somebody essentially steals from you know, in the sense that you have the right to get to that because either the copyright is expired on it, it was never copyrighted in the first place, or you created it. The current generation of things keep you from getting at it, and that's just plain wrong. Question over there?
Stephen King published a book last year, and I think he mentioned that he made twice or three times too much money on it, a short story or something, that if he would have sold it to a magazine. I don't know if it was the beginning effect or something, but he actually made more money by using the core protection mechanism that was broken after, I think, 2 or 3 days. He made more money. Do you think such kind of mechanism can be scaled up to, say, movie scale?
I think they can.
Could you repeat the question?
Sorry, the question was that last year Stephen King wrote a book that he published electronically, and even though the protections on it were broken after about 2 days, he made more money on it than he would have if he sold it to a magazine. And is that the sort of thing that can be scaled up? I think that the vast majority of people value things like liner notes. They value things like cover artwork. They value things that just the raw copy of the bits doesn't entail. My dear wife is a book collector, so you know she likes books as objects. And you know, it's like I'm not going to pay $18 for an ebook when I could buy the hardcover for $20. What happens if my disc crashes? I've never had a book crash on me. Bookcases, yes. one in the back there.
Yeah, you mentioned the mini-grids. Now, I know very little about copyright and others. You got notes when you said you could write your own stuff too and not get it back legally. Now, that sounds too stupid to be supportable in law. I think on UK law, that would simply be an appetite law that says you can't challenge this. You can't have laws which are that stupid basically in the UK.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's
Isn't it a technical issue, not a legal issue?
Yeah, that.
It is a legal issue. The thing is, how can that be supportable? How can it help out?
Well, my time is up. Okay, my time is up, they say, so.